All right, today I'm here with Louie, who spent over 27 years working for the U.S. State Department, and from 1980 to 1985, he worked specifically on nuclear arms control between the U.S. and USSR. Good morning, Louie.
Morning.
Can you please state your full name for the record?
Louis Sell.
And today's date is May 18th, 2024. All right, Louie, so just to get us started, how did you get into nuclear arms control?
I was recruited by Mark Palmer, who I met in Yugoslavia. When I was in Zagreb, Mark Palmer was the political counselor in Belgrade. He at a very young age, at 34, he was one of our outstanding sort of Soviet specialists in the State Department of my era. And he had met me in Zagreb. Mark, by 1980, when I was leaving Moscow, my first tour in 1980, Mark had become the head of the the State Department's SALT office, the office that was backstopped the SALT, Strategic Arm Limitation Talks Agreements. That was what they were called under Nixon and Carter. And when I was leaving Moscow, he recruited me to come to work in the SALT office for him, because we were going back to Washington after 6 years overseas. And so he came back, and that was election year, as you may recall. Well, you don't recall, but it was. And Carter happened to lose, and Reagan came in. Carter had negotiated the SALT agreement, SALT II agreement, wanted to get it ratified by the Senate. He'd pulled it back because of Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then he lost. So Reagan administration came in with a new approach. And so basically for a year, there were no U.S.-Soviet SALT talks. And our office, we were consumed with a lot of things, including starting to rethink the U.S. First, what do we do to get SALT II ratified by the U.S. Senate? And then what does Reagan want to do, and how do we contribute to new approach to strategic arms control? And anyway, there was no negotiations. So I had a whole year basically to spend really trying to get smart on this issue. And I didn't really know much about nuclear arms control or nuclear weapons, but I did a lot of reading, went to a lot of meetings, spent a lot of time on the intelligence, which was our primary source for information about Soviet nuclear arms control, Soviet nuclear arms, rather. And then finally, when the Reagan administration had its new approach together, and we were going to resume negotiations, and there was a new chief head of negotiations, an Army general, Army 3-star general, Ed Rowney, was going to be and who had long experience in SALT, but often from a critical point of view, and he had been Reagan's chief advisor on nuclear arms control during the 1980 campaign. Rowney was putting together his team, and he needed a special assistant. He wanted someone with Soviet experience. He wanted someone who spoke Russian, and I was what the State Department produced, and so I went to work for him and stayed in that role with the delegation for the next 4 years, and it was really quite rewarding.
Mm-hmm. And what did your role consist of as a special assistant?
Well, special assistant is basically kind of an alter ego to whoever you're special assistant to. As Rowney's assistant, I functioned as his kind of Soviet specialist, and he could see I really knew a lot. I knew a lot about the Russian Soviet Union. I knew a lot about Soviet arms Soviet weapons. I learned a lot about that. And he could see I knew how to write. And so I ended up basically doing most of his writing. Like a lot of people in the military, and fewer in the State Department, Rowney knew how to delegate, especially once he realized he could trust me in every way. And once we were in Washington, a lot of your work is in Washington, developing the internal U.S. position. So I would represent Rowney at the working group level on the nuclear arms control backstopping groups or policy groups, and then once we were overseas, once we were in negotiations, I basically I don't know how should I put this. I was his kind of substantive alter ego within the delegation. He counted on me to. I did all the reporting basically. I wrote. Our other members tended to write our delegation statements, but when we would meet with the Russians twice a week, and I would be there at 6 a.m. in the morning, getting things ready for him, and then I'd probably leave around midnight that day after all the reporting cables were done.
So what would you say the Reagan administration's approach to nuclear arms control for the Soviet Union was?
Reagan, and I have to say, Reagan was one of my heroes, but more for his policies toward the Soviet Union than anything else. But Reagan had his approach to nuclear arms control was twofold. He had two pillars to it, and Reagan's a very controversial figure even now, and he has opponents and he has supporters, and each of the opponents and the supporters each tend to focus on one element of his policy, but both are equally important. Wouldn't have succeeded as they did without either one. And the first was certainly rebuilding America's defenses and negotiating with the Soviet Union from a position of strength. That was critical. And not that we had sort of totally disarmed or basically adopted a pacifist position prior to Reagan, but we hadn't paid sufficient attention to our defenses during the 70s, Vietnam, and then the Vietnam hangover, and too often we hoped that arms control would prevent us from having to do what we needed to do to rebuild our nuclear deterrent. And Reagan came in understanding that's not going to work. You need to give the other side some incentive to negotiate. We needed to start rebuilding our nuclear forces, and the Soviets needed to see we were going to rebuild them so they would have some incentive to negotiate. Mm-hmm. And that was critical. The so-called Reagan military buildup, an important element. And the second was, however, was negotiations. If you want to agree with someone, you've got to negotiate. And that means you got to pay attention to what the other side wants to do, at least understand it. And maybe you can find some ways to reach a. And Reagan was willing to negotiate. He was eager to negotiate and a good negotiator. And so both of those were critically important. Also important, of course, was that he had a worthy partner in Mikhail Gorbachev on the Soviet side, who also wanted to negotiate, understood that the Soviets needed to negotiate.
Mm-hmm. And so can you tell us some about the U.S.-Soviet strategic arms reduction talks, otherwise called START?
START. Well, every new administration wants to rename these talks, and so and they want something catchy. So when we started the talks in 1969 under Nixon, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT talks. And so that's catchy, I guess, but Reagan came in, we got to have a new approach. And so we need a new acronym. And so Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, START. So it got in the notion of reduction, which was important because SALT II didn't really require any reductions. And Reagan believed in reductions, correct? And got into and it was kind of catchy. So it's START.
Yeah. And what were the delegations like? How did the talks proceed?
Well, the delegations it was basically the delegations on both sides really were the point institutions or the point outfits, point units in the skirmishing between two massive national security infrastructures in two huge countries, the Soviet side and the American side. And each of us had our own huge military structures. We had our own complicated national security structures. And these were talks on the most critical aspect of the whole relationship. And so these massive structures cared deeply about them. And the delegations kind of replicated that. So you had a chairman. When I was there were always men until later. Well, later we had women chair, not when I was involved though. And they were always from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, from State Department, or from the Soviet Ministry of Affairs. But within the delegation, there were components from the major aspects of the national security. So when we had a uniform military component, the JCS, Joint Chiefs of Staff, had a component. There was, in our side, the ACTA, Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, had a team. There was a State Department team. There was the Office of Secretary of Defense team, so the civilian side of the Pentagon. And then there was intelligence. There was an intelligence community with, obviously headed at that point by CIA, and they were responsible for the intelligence. And more or less, you had the same thing on the Soviet side.
Can you tell us anything about any of the big personalities that were at the table? Any of the sentiments?
Well, the personalities in some ways were less important because they were both outriders for these massive establishments behind them. And so the actual negotiation, it wasn't as much. It was talk, set pieces, and then we'd listen to what they had to say and absorb it and maybe come back and make some changes, and they might do the same thing. But the personalities were important. General Rowney, Ambassador Rowney, he left the military as an ambassador. I had a lot of respect for him. He was a controversial figure. A lot of the longtime arms controllers didn't think much of him and didn't like him too much because he as the head of the JCS in the SALT talks, he made it clear he thought we were going in the wrong direction. And that's why he went with Reagan. The Soviet head, you probably have to pause this and come back, and I'll give you his name later. He and Rowney had known each other for years and didn't much like each other, frankly. He was more of a figurehead than Rowney was. and but they worked out a relationship. And then after Rowney left, John Tower took over in the end, Senator Tower, and he was very respected congressional figure. And it was good to work with people like that, basically, who enjoyed respect across their own structures, across all of Washington, really.
Yeah. And
you got to meet people on the other side as well who did that, or people like one of Rowney's greatest, I thought, it was not inventions but decisions. This was a very controversial time in nuclear arms control. A lot of questioning about Reagan's approach, about nuclear arms control. It was a period of angst about nuclear war. Not that it isn't right to be concerned about it. And a lot of second guessing from Congress. So Rowney had the idea, let's bring the Congress over. And so we set up an informal team of senators. They were just senators because Senate has to ratify. And they would come, and they weren't part of the delegation, but once every round they would come once for a week or so, or a few days, and sit in on the talks and kind of bring them into the tent, and they could see what we were doing. And it was pretty worthwhile, pretty good.
Wow. And so, what exactly would it be that they were viewing? Were they just viewing the discussions?
They would sit on the talks. They would talk to all the Americans. They talk to the Soviets, and they come away from the understanding from the inside of what we were trying to do,
Yeah,
and be able to represent that on the Hill.
And I believe in 1983, the Soviets actually walked out of the START talks and didn't return until 1985. Do you have any insight into that?
Well, they walked out in '83 when the U.S. Decided to deploy intermediate nuclear forces in Europe. And there were two talks going on, more or less in parallel. There's the strategic arm talks, intercontinental systems, and then we had talks on intermediate nuclear forces, which was basically intermediate range forces in Europe. And the U.S., as part of our rebuilding, we needed to reestablish an intermediate nuclear force balance in Europe. And the Soviets desperately tried to stop that, pulled out all of the political stops, propaganda stops, and both in the negotiations and in the streets. And when finally the NATO alliance, with some difficulty, took the vote to deploy the U.S. force systems, Soviets walked out. This was the era of Andropov at head of the Soviet. It was the relationship, the U.S.-Soviet relationship across the board was really bad. And I had, in one of our earlier talks, I mentioned the shoot down of the KAL airliner, KAL 007, and the collapse in the relationship that caused. And this was September of '83, just 2 months before the deployment decision. And that the Soviets walked out thinking they would bring pressure on the European electorate and the American electorate to rescind that, to overturn that deployment decision, and actually in hopes that Reagan would not be reelected in '84. And when that failed, the alliance held firm. The American people decided to reelect Reagan, and they basically came back, and we started the talks again in January 1985.
And what did your team do in that interim period?
We spent a year basically. Well, we did two things, and that's a very good question. On one level, we spent a lot of time learning more about nuclear arms. Rowney he's a military guy, right? And so he knew about military stuff, although he was not an Air Force guy. He was not a strategic guy. He was an infantry officer. But a lot of the civilians like me, we knew a lot about Soviet nuclear weapons from the intelligence, but we actually knew less in some ways about American, because the CIA doesn't collect intelligence information on the American military. At least they say they don't, and I think they're telling the truth. So we should. Every time we would go out and we would visit military installations, strategic military installations that are important. And so, as a special assistant, I helped set those up. And we went to Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota in January to see B-52s and intercontinental missiles, and we went to various military bases around the United States to visit aspects of the American nuclear deterrent, to talk to the people actually doing it. And it was really invaluable. We learned a lot. Had some very interesting experiences. I was able to fly on a B-52 once and go on a nuclear submarine, and was in the process of setting up a trip to the South Pacific so we could go to Kwajalein when the talks resumed. And alas, we never made that trip.
Did all of that research you did in that interim period impact the way that you then approached negotiations when they resumed in '85?
To some extent, we knew a lot more, and like in the in the talks themselves, when we had twice a week we would meet in plenary session. Long table, U.S. side one, Soviet in the other, and chairman in the middle and his delegation along. And I'm always at the far right end of the U.S. delegation, and I'm the note taker. I'm doing all the reporting, and they knew who I was, but they never knew what. After the formal session, we'd break up into so-called post-plenary talks. So the senior American uniformed military officer would meet with his senior Soviet colleague, and the active person would meet with someone, and the State Department would meet with someone, and they never exactly knew what to do with me, because I could have sat in with Ron. If he didn't want me, I don't want anyone there but me. It's just two people, and my interpreter. He'll tell you what I say, and you can write it from that, or he'll tell me. And so, and sometimes they would put me with the Soviet intelligence guy, and because the agency did not sit in on that. The senior agency guy did not sit in on the plenaries on our side. I don't know why. He could have, but he didn't. So they put me there with the Soviet intelligence guy, and that had its interest of some sort, but less so. And then later they started to put me with a military guy, and it was clear they were doing that for a reason. And he was a submariner, and he started to talk, and it was good that I had actually, at least he was a submarine commander, right? At least I'd been on a submarine a couple times. And helped us develop a relationship.
And from your perspective, what was the critical breakthrough that made START possible?
Well, the critical breakthrough was at the Reykjavik summit in October of 1986. And behind what made it possible was, on the one hand, Reagan was reelected. The U.S. came back with Reagan in charge, determined to move forward with rebuilding U.S. defenses. And Gorbachev, in March of 1985, had come in as the new general secretary, the head of the Soviet Union, and he came clearly determined to change things in the Soviet Union, including in arms control, including in military affairs. And it took a while. For that for us to realize just how dramatic he was willing to go, and for him to realize too, in a way, how far he needed to go or wanted to go. But you had two people at the top who wanted to change, and we also had a structure under the first Reagan administration. We had START talks, and we made more progress than people give us credit for. If you read the histories of it, they tend to dismiss what happened in the first part of it, but I think it's wrong because we narrowed the gap. We were no more than a few hundred weapons apart, but we had fundamental philosophical issues and political issues which we hadn't reconciled. That's for sure. And to be fair, Reagan and George Shultz was Secretary of State, and they came in determined in the second round to really make change and created this. We created working groups outside of the delegation, which would meet on arms control at summits. And Paul Nitze was, and Reagan fired Rowney, or sidelined Rowney anyway. And I stayed with the delegation, at least for a while, until I was due to move on. I could have stayed if Tower wanted me to stay, but I thought seriously about staying, actually. But I had a good job in the Soviet desk, and so I left. But we had this structure on both sides of working groups outside the delegate when the summit would meet, or even sometimes outside of the summit. We had at a lower level working groups in substantive areas in the bureau. The two bureaucracies could get things done where decision makers would meet. And so on the arms control side, we had a working group headed by Paul Nitze, who was Shultz's chief advisor on arms control. And on the Soviet side, it was headed by Marshal Akrameyev, who was head of the Soviet General Staff. In other words, the most senior uniformed military officer in the Soviet Union who could actually make decisions too, unlike anyone else in the Soviet delegation. And so when the two sides would meet, they would have plenary talks, but they would also break for serious negotiations at the working group level, and that's what happened in Reykjavik. And Gorbachev came with a sweeping Soviet proposal, which incorporated a lot of what we had been saying and had been rejected. And Reagan and we heard that. I wasn't at Reykjavik. I had left. I was on the Soviet desk, but I was back to doing bilateral stuff, including human rights, which I'm going to talk about later if you want separately. But and so after the first day, the U.S. and Soviet working group came together and they worked all night, and they actually were reaching agreement. They were actually reaching agreement on numbers, reductions, and principles, and on the offensive side, on strategic offensive arms, which is what we were talking about. Mm-hmm. And clearly we were making progress. But then the talk turned to ballistic missile defense, BMD, and there was no give on the Soviet side, and there wasn't much give on the U.S. side either. And both the sides of the working group said, well, we've gone as far as we can, turn it back to the to the leaders. And so they did. Gorbachev and Reagan met, and in ways that are still not fully understood by people. Eventually, they actually started to build on what the working groups had achieved, and they actually started to negotiate and reach agreement among those two guys at the table on serious major reductions, including eliminating offensive nuclear weapons. And they went that far. Reagan, it's too complicated to get into it. Basically, they had reached the stage where, in principle at least, we can agree to eliminate offensive strategic nuclear weapons. And then, okay, great. And then the subject turned to defense, so to what we called ballistic missile defense, to BMD, and Gorbachev said, yes, we have to eliminate defensive weapons, and at that point the agreement collapsed. Reagan was unwilling to do that, and Gorbachev was unwilling to agree to anything unless we did that, and the two guys walked away, quite angry with each other, actually.
And what year was this?
October of '86. And I've summarized a lot. It was pretty dramatic. I was not there. I worked on the summit, obviously, in the desk, but I was no longer doing arms control. They didn't want me doing arms control. They thought I was too close to Rowney and Reagan, probably. And but talking to people, talking to my friends the day they came back, they were still in shock. They called it a feeding frenzy of on this, what really happened was, so that it looked, if you read the press about Reykjavik, and both Reagan and Gorbachev left angry at each other, and it showed in what they said to the press. And the press described this as a huge failure, and on the U.S. side, et cetera, and but it wasn't, because behind the scenes, both sides had showed how far they were willing to go to reach an agreement. And in a way, the Soviets had made a big mistake. They had shown how far they were willing to go to reach agreement with us, and so after a time to kind of let tempers cool, we went back to them and started saying, well, you said you were willing to cut nuclear weapons in half, so let's just do it. And eventually, I'm simplifying, but it took 5 more years. But the outlines of that agreement were reached in October of '86, and finally achieved start one, cut nuclear weapons by roughly 1/2, and did a lot of other things too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so START 1 was signed in 1991.
Right.
And then there was a second START agreement that happened during your second tour in Moscow, which was in 1991 through 1994. Were you involved at all in that second START agreement?
I was, not formally, but in arms control. But basically, the process, the experience of taking 5 years from Reykjavik to signing soured so many people in both bureaucracies, the American and the Soviet, about that after START 1, both sides agreed we needed to get away from formal delegations sitting in Geneva, as Gorbachev said at one time, eating their way through mountains of gold rubles in the restaurants of Geneva, and get the decision makers together regularly. And so we started with something in America was called the UNGroup. The senior American figures would meet with the senior Soviet figures, and started doing that. This was under George Bush the first, and they would meet either in Washington or in Moscow, and when they weren't meeting, so I'm in Moscow, and people knew me. I knew arms control. People knew me, and so I was sort of the messenger back and forth when they weren't actually physically meeting. And I knew the Soviets as well from my days in START. And it's by the fall of '93. Summer, I guess it was. I think I remember exactly, but we had reached agreement on START 2, and basically cutting, in summary form, cutting nuclear forces by another 1/2. So if START 1 limited nuclear ballistic missile warheads to 6,000, START 2 limited them to 3,000 to 3,500 on each side, and many other limits as well. It was very dramatic and really quite almost unthinkable, and required a lot of major changes on the Soviet side. They had to, and now I'm getting now to a question you asked earlier about lessons learned. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and lesson learned maybe is don't push the other side too hard or beyond the level of which the START 2 was a good agreement, and it was good for both sides, and both sides tacitly observed it, but it never actually went into force because it required the Soviets to give up too many sacred cows, if you will. It looked like it went too far in our direction. It didn't. It was good for them too. But how did we get it? And I remember talking, and how did we get that agreement? And there was by this time it's '93, so there's actually a democratic Russia to some extent, and there's a parliament that has power in the Soviet Union, and there are committees, and the Soviet military was learning how to operate in a sort of a democracy, and they were learning how we can go to the parliamentarians and tell them we don't like what the Americans are doing here, and you guys ought to know this and help us. And so there was a parliamentary opposition, which we managed to overcome essentially by a threat. And we said, okay, look, if you guys are not going to, this is a paraphrase, all right? I don't know, and I've written about this, but I don't know if it's ever been acknowledged anywhere else. If there isn't a START 2, okay, but we, the United States, will observe START 1. The much higher limits on nuclear weapons of START 1, which we could do, but the Soviet Union and the Russia rather, in the pretty chaotic conditions of after the collapse, they couldn't afford to maintain that position. And that was kind of an arm twisting. And my Russian friends said that was what carried the day in Moscow.
Who did you say said that?
I honestly don't know who gave him that threat.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know who it was who actually made that message. But that's the message they got. And they said, my friends in the Soviet Russian side said that eventually was what made them give in.
Do you feel like?
But anyway, it was in a way we were taking advantage of their weakness. and it was for in a good cause, but maybe we went too far.
Would you say that during the Second START agreement, your vantage point from the embassy changed the way that you saw the overall negotiations?
Well, that was the last time I had anything to do really with nuclear arms control in an operational sense. And I think I think it's fair to say that I could thought about these things more in the way I've just told you. But there's also what's right. There are also bureaucratic realities on both sides, and whether we had said what we did or not, the reality was we were going to live with START 1. We signed the agreement. They signed the agreement. But yeah, the lesson is you need to be aware of what the other side can and can't do, and decide whether or not you can reach agreement within that parameter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for a last question, in February of 2023, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that he would suspend the New START treaty. So I'm curious, what advice would you give to young diplomats, either U.S. or Soviet, or not Soviet, but Russian, that might be a part of future negotiations?
Well, to young diplomats, I would say what I was able to do was excellent preparation. I spent some time, able to spend some time really learning a lot about a very complicated subject, and on both sides. And so that's important to more senior people who are going to do the actual negotiating. I would say just what I just said earlier. You know, this on one level, this subject of the nuclear relationship, it's too important to let slide. We're in a dangerous situation right now. Not that there's a lot of talk about about threats of nuclear war, and I don't see that really. But there is too much loose talk about nuclear war, particularly on the Russian side now, and this decades-long experience of nuclear arms control took forever, was filled with very often very frustrating negotiations, but it created two things. One, among the bureaucracies of both sides, an understanding of each other. So senior military, senior civilian people got to know each other, and that was really important, and got to have some confidence in the other side. And that was really important in reaching these agreements. And that's gone now. We got to rebuild that somehow. And the other thing is these agreements, where there was a fabric of either written or unwritten understandings in these treaties. Like the START 1 agreement is like this thick, and it has all sorts of verification and monitoring and confidence building measures, which are really important. And they kind of with START 2, we started to nibble away at those. And the new START agreement retains a lot of that, but a lot what we call counting rules. And it's very complicated, but we don't really count actual warheads. We count things that the warheads sit on, namely ballistic missiles. And we don't even count ballistic missiles, but we count the way they look like when they're in the ground or when they're out on patrol, and if they're mobile. And so there were a whole lot of rules regulating how we count those things, and things of inspections and procedures, which were really important in building confidence. And if the new START goes away, they go away. And are we going to have to renegotiate those? And it may be too late because we got so many new types of weapons, mobile missiles. I don't know. But anyway, the lesson is the sooner the better we get to negotiating agreements, nuclear agreements, the better.
All right. Thank you for your time, Louie.